Okay.
Welcome to the Grid Podcast, episode number 7. Our goal is to educate and to bring hard hitting truths about America's critical infrastructure. I'm your host, Maria Sumnicht, and political opinions expressed on the podcast by participants are their opinion and not necessarily that of the Grid Podcast. Please hit and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you will be notified when we go live. Like the videos, and it helps us to promote it on YouTube. So today, our topic today is hospital resilience and a black sky event. The perils and threats against our healthcare system if a black sky event were to happen needs to be addressed as a national priority. Today, the Grid Podcast is honored to have hospital systems engineer John Juhasz, an international authority on critical infrastructure, resilience, and preparedness. John, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you got involved with hospital resilience?
Will do. Thank you, Maria. Appreciate the opportunity to be on your podcast. I've monitored a number of your events. I'm very impressed with the quality of people, and so I appreciate your asking me to join. And I am John Juhasz. I have about a half century of systems engineering and technical engineering in my background. Mostly former NASA engineer, worked on space station, the power system. I learned a great deal of interesting insights about how to maintain resilience, absolutely critical resilience on the power structure with that kind of an architecture. So I'm hoping that we can bring a lot of that technology to terrestrial applications. That's part of it. Also have spent a good deal of time in the automotive sector and transportation and so on. And more recently, I've been involved with an organization called INCOSI, actually about 3 decades worth of INCOSI systems engineering. It's the International Council on System Engineering. So that's my primary professional background. And I have been involved as well with the FIR, a new organization, a nonprofit that's the Foundation for Infrastructure Resilience. Very, very esteemed group of colleagues who are former military, former law enforcement, utility execs, others who are dedicated to the proposition that we can improve our national energy systems, our infrastructure systems, by supporting efforts at the national level in government and also in the private sector. So that's how I got involved about 10 years ago or so with a group that started from Infragard and began to form as FIR. And our efforts more recently have been focused on how do we improve the resilience of our individual infrastructures, such as hospitals. So we have some project work underway on looking at a particular hospital and improving its capabilities. I'll hopefully I can dive into some of that as we go forward. And also at the national level, we are promoting the adoption of some policies that will help us to protect our national grid and all of our infrastructure individual elements. So basically, that's the story for now, Maria. I'll be happy to get into details.
Yeah, so let's dive right in. You have a presentation you would like to share with the audience on the state of hospital resilience and the ability to survive a black sky event. So,
All right.
so hang on a sec.
Please.
There we go. There we go.
So tell me what you see.
I see improving hospital resilience, a collaborative.
Okay, thank you. So that's working. So as I mentioned, I'm a member of both the FIR and INCOSI, and I'm considering this effort here, this project, as a collaborative effort. We have members in FIR who are actively involved in this, as well as members of INCOSI, and I think it's a good fit to move further along on this path. But the effort is intended to examine how I think the overarching requirement, I would argue, is provided, and there's a slide in here from the World Health Organization and other organizations that administer hospital credentials. And the mandate is that even under dire conditions, such as a widespread blackout, you have to maintain operations. What exactly that means and how do you maintain it is a huge question. And it seems like it's not well defined. Individual hospitals are challenged more or less to come up with their own methods of preserving, the integrity of that hospital and also, of course, the patients therein. There's a large amount of controversy about how to do that, and how do you do that by minimizing loss of life? It's likely that under such dire conditions, we've seen this before. There have been a number of events like this where people are going to suffer to some extent. Our hope, our mission is try to come up with solutions that will minimize loss of life, and that requires maintaining some kind of operations capability. So that's the overall arching goal. Uh,
So before we go on, let's define what a black sky event is for
Okay,
listeners.
I'm happy to do that for you, Maria. I thought that this slide, I kind of call this our wake up slide because it wakes us up to the possibility that we might encounter a situation like we did in 2003. That's kind of a perfect case study for defining what black sky means. And our internal definition is that you have suffered a widespread outage. I'm sure many people in the audience remember the 2003 blackout. And by the way, that's only one of a number of them. I mentioned Katrina, the hurricane that hit Louisiana at the time, and of course there was also Hurricane Sandy that hit the East Coast, and the big one in 2021 was the Texas ice storm that knocked out the entire grid in Texas. Those are all typical examples of a black sky event. So what we're calling it is something that has a widespread area of outage, as for example 2003. If you can see this little bright dot sort of in the upper right corner, that represents Chicago. Everything to the east of Chicago rippled all the way up to into New England and into Canada. So obviously a widespread area that affected a lot of people. The second element is we don't know when it's going to be resolved. You can try to call utilities, and if somebody even picks up the phone, you'll get an answer that says, "We're working on it. We don't know when it's going to be restored." Most likely, you won't even get an answer. The third part is that there's no communication because you've got an outage with significant consequence. You've knocked out the cell towers and internet and so on. So now you have internal to a facility like a hospital. If you're at home and you're suffering from a black sky, most likely everybody will hunker down with candles and blankets and so on and wait it out.
Mhm.
In a hospital, the challenge is far greater because you have to maintain continuity of operations. Uh, you have to preserve the life of patients the best way you can. And that means that you have to have some form of supplemental power and even things like water. Water becomes a very critical resource. You have to have a whole number of things that you can maintain. Our current focus on this project is how we preserve power sufficient to maintain the facility and continue to keep the patients alive, and also water. And water has a very interesting set of requirements, but we can get into that in a moment. Okay, so that's the overview.
So,
Let me
so,
go ahead.
so you mentioned a few possible causes. Obviously, weather related causes such as Katrina and Hurricane Sandy. And then I believe in 2003 there was the whole Northeast lost power,
That's
and
this, yes.
yeah,
Hmm.
and and then of course we have the infamous Hurricane Maria that
Oh,
devastated
yes.
Puerto Rico.
I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that
But
without
yeah,
any implications there. But yes,
it,
Hurricane Maria was a disaster for all of Puerto Rico. The entire island was wiped out. So there's a perfect example as well. And we are currently, of course, concerned about what's happening in Jamaica. It's almost a similar kind of episode. But those are perfect examples, Maria, and I appreciate you bringing that up. So,
so
to,
also
yes.
like what are the potential consequences would a hospital face
Well,
in a black swan?
that's a great question. That's exactly the nature of this project that we're involved in, and we are. By the way, let me address your other question about the causes. So we identified two different categories. One of them is caused by nature itself, natural causes, including weather, the environment, and all the examples you mentioned, Puerto Rico and Sandy and others. Even the ice storm in Texas were caused by weather, and so that triggered a whole lot of consequence. But also, you might have equipment failures, less frequent to have a widespread blackout, but it also happens. Sometimes nature interferes by having tree limbs hit a high tension wire and cause a lot of disruptions. Uh, little critters like squirrels and others can do that. We might experience in our current environment, as we're starting to grow a massive amount of data center requirements for power. We're going to find that we're going to run short on power in some areas, and there might be rolling brownouts. Some of that's happening in California, and we're gearing up for that. And then there's this phenomenon called space weather. That includes things like coronal mass ejections from the sun. So solar storms, otherwise known space weather, can
Can
cause significant disruptions on.
some people might not know what a corona mass ejection is. Can you
Yes.
just briefly explain it and an example of when
Well, yeah. If
it
you
happens?
if you've seen activities that happen on the surface of the sun, you see a whole lot of volatility there. On occasional basis, actually on a frequent basis, the sun ejects a a substantial amount of plasma. Plasma is a conductive energy that arrives throughout the entire solar system, and it interferes with the Earth's magnetosphere. Anything that's conductive can cause a magnetic field to collapse and to basically react to that conductive plasma. So those kind of conditions, geomagnetic disturbance is another acronym for that, GMD. They can cause a substantial i- disruption on the Earth's cabling and all the electrical uh, currents that we're running through the distribution lines, transmission lines. So that's what space weather is about. And we did have an event like that in about '89. Was a massive GMD that hit, which affected a large portion of Quebec in the Canadian area, and also parts of, I think, the upper eastern states. And GMDs are also predicted to be increasing in frequency. It's hard to predict those, but we do have a sense of when they might arrive. On the other hand, you have another category here called human causes. And there's a list of some of those that we have experienced in the past, and we can anticipate again. Human failure, the 2003 blackout, by going back to that, had an element of human error in it, but the failure propagated all the way out from mostly the Midwest to the East Coast and so on. And then, of course, cyber attacks. You know a great deal about that from your experience. They can be very disruptive and cause the grid to go down in certain regions. Vandalism, sabotage, etc. I think the granddaddy, the mother of all threat scenarios is electromagnetic pulse. Now, the FIR and the former group NDRC had spent a good deal of time studying electromagnetic pulse, and that is a phenomenon that can be it's a human-caused event. Uh, Basically, a nuclear explosion in the atmosphere, well positioned above the continental U.S., can cause a widespread disruption by knocking out electronic circuits, by causing massive waveform disruptions in the ground currents that affect all the utilities, and maybe completely destroy transformers, the high voltage transformers that we have. And that's the one that we have to worry about to a large extent, causing a nationwide potentially black sky event. So those are some of the potential causes, and that takes us to uh, for the hospital. For the case of the hospital project, our mission is not to ponder what caused the outage, but it's to react and to be prepared in the event of an outage. It's to figure out how do we maintain that continuity. We're not likely to ever know what maybe caused the event. When a blackout happens, it just happens,
Mm-hmm.
and you're left to wonder, well, I don't know what caused it, but now we've got to survive. Now we've got to take action and figure out how to protect our patients and so on.
Right.
So that's the mission of the hospital resilience project that you asked about. Okay,
Wonderful.
so so that takes us to here. That's where we are with the Black Sky Hospital event. So, do you have some further
No, no.
insights you want?
Let's go right into it.
Okay, so our mission is maintaining continuity of operations. We're suddenly confronted with this black sky. The hospital administration says, "Oops, we don't know." Again, the definition is you don't know how widespread it is, but you can look out the window and see nothing basically because everybody else in the area is also blacked out. You also have no idea when it's going to be restored. You have no communication. You have no expectation that you can get resupply from anyone outside. Basically, there's no cavalry coming to the rescue because everyone is suffering from the same conditions. So the idea is to figure out how do we maintain sufficient capability within that hospital so that we're not having to face a shutdown scenario in a matter of a few days. Now, typically, most hospitals will be prepared to have backup power,
Mm-hmm.
backup generation capacity, and they have on site, they have fuel storage. Typically, they're required to store up to maybe 3 to 4 days worth of fuel, so 96 hours and so on. But if we are really going to experience and be prepared for a black sky, we have to plan for much longer than that, as we know from some of our examples that we mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
and from the likelihood that if we have a massive strike like a GMD, solar storm, or an EMP, we could be out for potentially weeks or months.
Yep.
And the FIR, as you know, Maria, we've studied this problem. A number of our eminent scholars have postulated that if you have a massive EMP strike, we could, as a society, be down for months and lose a very large part of our population. So that's the thing that's most worrisome. We're therefore committed to seeing how we can build infrastructure that is resilient as much as possible and can survive as long as possible
Mm-hmm.
without power. And the other critical resource is water. We're focused on those two fundamental areas. Okay. So basically, let me walk through this slide. I mentioned earlier that there's an overarching requirement, which is that a disaster does not remove the day-to-day requirement for essential medical and surgical services, et cetera, et cetera. But the availability of essential services needs to continue in parallel with the activation of a hospital emergency response plan. So under black sky, things have to go on as best they can. Of course, you're going to restrict
Mm-hmm.
how many types of treatments you can manage for patients. You're going to defer everything that's an elective procedure and focus only on those things that are life-threatening or life-saving procedures. But our focus then is on backup power and water activation. Of course, getting rid of any non-essential loads. The fewer demand for power we have, the longer we can maintain that generation capacity, and conserving our critical resources. That's where we're focusing on right now. What's going on inside the hospital during black sky? Okay. Uh, I just mentioned this very briefly. This some of the options that we're looking at. We have to solve this equation. Supply is equal to demand plus reserve. Nothing magical about that. It's the same equation that you have in accounting when you have, you know, revenue equals expenses plus profits and so on. It's the same idea. So the only options that there exist is we can either increase the supply, and again, our focus is on power and water, or we can decrease the demand, or most likely both. Okay, now there's more to it, the whole equation than that. We also have to look at medical supplies and inventory, food supplies. If you have people hunkered down in a hospital, they still have to eat, they have to drink, they have to use the facilities, and so on. So you have to have some level of staffing, space, beds. All of those are considerations. But our primary focus is right now: how do we get enough power to maintain the continuity, and how do we also make sure that we have water that we can store in safe containers so that it can be used for as long as possible and continue to generate new water. Okay, so does that make sense
Yeah,
to
yeah.
you?
And I do want to mention, I want to go back to Katrina because that was just such a huge
Sure.
debacle, where there was a major hospital in New Orleans that thought they were
Yeah.
ready, right? Because they know they're very vulnerable. And But if everything could have and did go wrong, which it did, can you talk about some of the what they could have done in order to not have the situation that they wound themselves in? And you can talk more about that.
Well, I think one of the hospitals you're mentioning, of course, and we'll just reserve the name, but I know
Yeah,
they had massive flooding problems. They had a generator that was on the first floor or the lower floor, and obviously flooding took over and knocked out the entire generator. So the hospital was in a black sky event, of course. It was almost impossible. There was no opportunity, really. I think they did manage to evacuate some patients, but broad scale evacuation was not feasible with the road conditions and without a destination where they could even move the patients. There was no clear pathway to doing that. So the sad reality, and that was only one example, but that was the major one. That reality was that about 40 some patients were left in the hospital when it had to close. That's the nightmare scenario that's confronting
right,
hospitals and facilities when you're running into a black sky of this nature. So in fact, we use that as our kind of a mission example to avoid. We're trying to avoid a scenario where we have to repeat that
right.
situation. Okay.
So, one of the things obviously that the hospitals could look at right now, especially in areas that are water prone. So let's use some cities like New Orleans, the New York City greater area, the whole coastline there. And These areas are prone to flooding, the Carolinas on the coast.
Sure.
And you have your hospital has its generator on a first floor. You might think that you you need to move that, or at least have another backup that is on a higher floor, or
Yeah.
somewhere where at least the 30-foot wave wouldn't impact it, right? And we've seen 30-foot waves come through, so that would be something for hospitals to
Yeah.
consider in their planning.
Sure. Yeah,
Right.
and that's a really challenging situation. You can't take a massive generator of the type that they need to sustain a hospital and put it up on a high floor. It's
Yeah.
very difficult. But our focus on this effort, we're actually trying to look beyond the capacity of a backup generator. We're trying to look at ways that we can develop a power source that is independent of the backup generator that would survive longer than the backup generator. In other words, it would continue to provide power. Typically, solar is one of those categories, but it's not the only one. There are some new technologies that are emerging, and we're excited about them, especially about generating water from the atmosphere. So that's one of the things we're implementing right now in the research effort on this hospital,
Mm-hmm.
an atmospheric water generator that's capable of producing some amount of critical water. Critical meaning high purity. It's water is a very interesting resource because it's just not any kind of water. We can't just take water from the ocean, that's salt water, and start to use it everywhere. It's not going to work. We have to desalinate, and for critical uses like drinking, uh, for sterilization and other uses, we have to have high purity, reasonably clean water. Dialysis is another category.
Mm-hmm.
People on dialysis have to have the highest level of purity. So we have to address not just how much water can we need, but how do we maintain the levels of purity that are necessary. So that's the challenge, and we're hoping that we can come up with solutions. We're not in the solution phase yet. We're still doing the research, but there are very promising technologies on the horizon that would allow us to maintain power and water
Water.
independent of the utilities and even independent of the backup generator.
Yep. And I've actually seen some of the technology in the water category where water is produced out of air. Uh,
Right.
yeah, and that technology is actually right at the cusp of really becoming something that it can be available, especially to hospitals. Um,
Right.
so, do you believe that our hospitals and our clinics are prepared if a black sky event were to occur tomorrow? It could.
You've got me on the spot now, Maria, but
Uh,
it could happen tomorrow. It could happen right after we hang up on this
yeah,
call, but because and that's one of the unfortunate phenomena. Nobody knows when it's going to hit.
yeah.
Okay, so you're giving virtually no notice, especially, uh, of course, with weather you have some advance notice, so
Hmm.
you can take evasive action if you anticipate a hurricane coming. But with something like an EMP, it's very hard to have forecasting. It's going to happen when it happens, and you're going to be totally in the dark. Uh, why is it so challenging? It's obviously we're just not ready yet to have the kind of capability, and hospitals are struggling with this. Of course, there are no clear good solutions about how do you generate enough power. So part of our study right now is going through a series of exercises to allow the hospital management to figure out how can they reduce the demand for all of the facility functions that are necessary. You gotta, it's not just a question of patient treatment, but you got to have certain facility capabilities. You got to be able to generate heat and air conditioning or climate control and so on. You got to be able to prepare food if people are hunkered down for weeks. You got to be able to have some food stocks on. All of these things are very challenging, and they require power and water. Right. So our approach is to figure out how we can provide just enough. I mean, we can using the resources around the hospital. What kind of properties they might have, and what kind of solar or other kinds of production they were potentially able to generate. We are looking at ways that they can produce enough power and enough water to maintain operations. It does not mean it's going to be a luxurious, uh, like a blue sky scenario. And,
Hmm.
and blue sky, there's no problem with powering all the equipment you need. Under black sky, you have to be extremely selective on what you use
Yep.
that consumes that vital resource.
Yep. Yeah. No, this is great. Thank you. Why do you believe hospitals have been challenged to make their facilities more resilient?
That's exactly the point. Is because there are no there are no clear pathways forward right now.
Yeah.
You can't maintain fuel on site to power the hospital for weeks or months. That's just not practical. You're going to run out of fuel within a matter of days. Whether and one of the things that I'd like to show is that when you are confronted with, here's an example of a highly simplified schematic of a hospital system, right? Everything inside this dashed green box is
Mhm.
what's internal to the hospital. And outside, you may have one or two. Most hospitals have dual utility connections in case one utility fails, you got a backup. However, on a widespread outage like a black sky, both utilities most likely will be out. And that's what's, of course,
Mm.
happened in the cases we mentioned. What happens then is you have the internal backup generator that's running off of a fuel supply. And that's the only source of power you have to equip all of these different functional areas. We got, of course, operating room, we got lab facilities, maybe emergency department, and so on. All these departments which are operating with various electrical loads. The trick is to figure out, well, which ones must I maintain. For example, the data system. I got to be able to run, you know, uh, the patient records are still maintained in IT and the internal IT system, so we got to keep that alive. There might be an additional UPS is an uninterruptible power supply. The same thing with the operating room. Most operating rooms have their own backup power capability that will allow them, in case a black sky happens when you're in the middle of an operation. Imagine the disaster if all the lights go out and you can't finish, after you've just started an open heart surgery. So they have power that is independent of the facility's backup that will allow them to finish an operation, maybe up to 12 hours in many cases. So that's an example of a critical function that would have to be maintained, during a black sky event. And so each one of these categories has some of their own protective mechanisms. But the broad picture is, okay, we want to minimize the total demand so we can maintain the fuel as long as possible. And at the same time, we want to bring in some additional source of power, like a solar panel or a series of panels that would allow for operation even after you've run out of fuel. And that's the whole key. How much can we scale up on the solar side in order to keep that hospital operating
Yeah.
under those conditions?
So,
Similar picture just for the water. So we have an atmospheric water unit creating water separate from the utility in case the water utility is disrupted, which it would be. Yeah, go ahead.
oh no, I'm just asking. In the cybersecurity world, we have NIST, we have CISA. Is there a governing body over our hospital system or in our clinic systems um, that they have to meet certain standards as far as
Yes.
resiliency? Oh,
Yes,
good.
there is a joint commission for hospital accreditation. That is the governing body. The only problem with that is that under the conditions that we're talking about, where we have a widespread outage, there's
Mhm.
not a very well defined requirement of what hospitals are expected to do. So, what exists in addition to the Joint Commission are individual state health boards. Each state has its own health authority, and their mission is to establish what they call crisis standards of care. Okay, when you're in a crisis, you have to maintain certain standards. Again, the problem with that is we got 50 states, and you can see if you examine those, you'll see there's 50 different types of requirements. Each state comes up with its own. Some of them are extremely rigorous. You got to follow to the letter. California being an example of that. There's so many restrictions. Others, and I'm not going to mention the states, but some are very casual. The hospital board at the state level says, you guys are in charge of your patients, you hospital administrators, so do the best you can. Good luck. And that's the mandate. So the pressure is on the hospitals really to find the best way they can to maintain continuity of operations. And that's where we're focusing our efforts, is to give them the kind of assistance that they're looking for.
So I know you're really involved with the Foundation for Infrastructure Resiliency, and you're working on this plan. But and is there? You mentioned that you are. Is there a pilot happening? Are you working with a
Yes,
facility right now?
we're working with an active facility in the Midwest. It's a small town hospital. It's we wanted to focus on a hospital that we have an ability to basically study with some reasonable boundaries of known conditions. So we chose this hospital, and we are very blessed to have the support of that administration. And when we get past this project, of course, we would look forward to working with the larger complexes, John Hopkins and Cleveland Clinic and others. But they are so massive; it's very hard to get your arms around it. So we chose a hospital that is a well-defined system in its own category. It's a system with a boundary. It has a well-defined structure, and so on. That allows us to come up with some solutions that we think will work for that type of hospital. But as you scale up to the larger size facilities, we will have to study ways multiple buildings are involved and so on, campuses. You have to have a microgrid literally that serves that entire campus. And that's another ongoing focus area. How do you decentralize the grid to make infrastructure resilient? You have to have power that powers that entire complex. You can imagine that and I live in Cleveland, so places like the Cleveland Clinic have a number of different facilities that are distributed around the area, and that's a much more complex picture. But we are working with right now, as I mentioned, the hospital in a small town, and it's a much easier problem to study, as much as the problem is still very challenging. So hopefully, we'll be able to solve this one.
So in essence, hospital resiliency is still a ways out. In other words, where especially in big cities,
Yes,
they're a
I know.
time frame like 3 to 5 years out, but we know that the threats are here today.
We
So,
we know, and well, that's a great question, and I want to expand on that just a bit. We're actually, again, it's a little bit of an easier challenge to deal with a hospital in a small town because the opportunity for studying that problem is reasonably well confined.
mhm,
As you get into the cities, you have a whole lot more layers of complexity involved. So we're going to get there, but yes, it's going to take a little bit longer. And to your question about predicting when, that's a great question. We're right now hopeful that we can solve this particular problem at a smaller regional town. Maria, the thing that occurs to me is I have to say it's almost ironic that we're living in a time when we have created so much technology that has advanced our civilization. And you're going to find as we are confronted with these threat scenarios like these black skies, the parts of civilization that are less developed are much more likely to survive. And that's because they're less dependent on technology. When we suddenly remove all the technology, and of course, without power, you literally lose so much, you lose everything. We have a much harder time adapting in the bigger cities than we do in the rural areas. And the countries that are less developed probably will do quite well,
mhm.
even with an EMP strike. But we're going to have to learn how to, as an advanced civilization, how to really survive this challenge.
Well, it's almost as there's a gap, right? I don't know. I'm going to come up with a name here, like a techno gap, for lack of a better term, where we have all this advanced technology like AI. I
Right,
mean, things are moving faster than the speed of sound. It seems like it every day. There's just something new. But then our
right.
critical infrastructure is really held together, by a wing and a prayer. There's
Yes.
it, and so in between, we have the technology that is advancing us at phenomenal speeds, but the foundation is faulty, right? That are, it, that's what I'm seeing as I myself am going into these areas like the electrical grid, the water. I was involved in quite a bit when I was in New York City, but it's antiquated, and the technology of the future, and then there's this chasm. The bridging isn't there.
Well, that's a
Just-
really interesting perspective. I'm sure many of us here, and myself, as well as people in the audience, are struggling with how did we get here, right?
right, right.
How do we get to all of this wonderful technology, AI and everything, and yet can be confronted with this massive challenge? It's really quite an
Exactly.
interesting question.
Yeah.
I can only ponder that, you have to think about this. The current grid architecture that we have, the electrical grid architecture, is something that was designed in the 90s, but not the 1990s, the 1890s, right? It was at the origin of the whole industrial revolution that Edison and Tesla, when they had their big debate about DC versus AC power and so on. That's when this architecture was born. Of course, AC was the preferred method of transmitting over long distances, and that's why we have a large network of transmission infrastructure and so on. The question now is this: we have obviously, as a society, since 1890 and 1880, we've evolved a great deal. We have a
Mhm.
whole new series of requirements. We got to power all these data centers. We got to maintain our resilience so that society doesn't crumble with a loss of power. We have a whole new layer of requirements that have to be considered. So now, question is, as we build out the rest of our needs, I mentioned
Mhm.
1x or 2x of capacity. That's a 100 to 200% increase. Are we going to build it with the same architecture that was designed in the 1890s? Or are we going to try to look at what are the modern society's absolute requirements that we must have? And we must have resilience. We must have the ability
Mhm.
that calls for a different kind of architecture that says we better start thinking about how to decentralize and not have a single event, like a massive EMP event, knock out all of our capabilities.
Right.
So by decentralizing and using the best new technologies that we have, we can build the resilience that's necessary for the next layer, the 100%, 200% additional capacity. But that's going to require like a national um mobilization strategy, just like I use the term Manhattan. Everybody's now kind of adopted that Manhattan style project, but it's a very serious situation. We have to confront this. But by the way, even the single um variable of capacity, if we don't meet the needs for all of the powering of data centers, and that's not the only thing, but it's all the electrical vehicle, electrical transportation, all of the onshoring of facilities. We don't meet the requirements to supply the necessary energy. We are going to be in big trouble
Yeah.
because we're going to lose the race. We may be ahead in the AI technology, but if we can't power the data centers, or if we have to steal power from other critical infrastructure to keep up to that, then we're going to have a serious problem. So we've got to rethink, I
Exactly.
think, and re-architect the entire energy system.
Yeah.
That's my personal view.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree with that, especially if you're looking at 18, like I said, at the foundation, an 1890 foundation, and here we are in 2025, right? And nothing has changed. Things have to change. Now, there's a really good comment and a question, a really great question. There's a comment here by David Moran that says, Energy Field Security has an SMR project on on Delta Health Hospital campus that will provide emergency communications, productions of hot water to their boiler and produce sterilized water. So that's
Well,
good. That's good to know.
that's very interesting. Love to. Hopefully, we can capture that link and maybe pursue it. But be happy
Yeah,
to take a look at that in our research effort.
yeah. And at the end, if you could tell us how to get a hold, your contact info, maybe David can reach out to you and talk about.
Oh,
He's,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Well, you can put that into the
Yeah,
chat, Maria.
yeah, yeah, I'll put
I,
that in the chat.
yeah.
And James Turbush asked, John, will you please mention the need for resilient people to operate resilient hospitals? Great question.
Of course. That's my good colleague, Dr. Terbush. Yes, we are, of course, much aware and concerned about the fact that any kind of an event of the kind we're talking about is going to really stress the human factor here. Every staff member on a hospital is probably going to be, first of all, concerned about what's going on at home. If you got a black sky event, you maybe have, your wife, your kids, your family, or your pets needing your attention. That's going to motivate a lot of people to say, I got to get out of here. But I'm gonna suggest that for the purpose of preparation, part of the exercise that we're going through here is to help with improved planning for emergencies. There's going to have to be some type of an arrangement made with critical staff. We haven't really studied in depth all of the staffing issues that are going to be at risk here, but we know that to anticipate something like this black sky, you have to have some level of staff on which you can count. That means you have to have it prearranged. There has to be some kind of an agreement in place. And we're looking at that as a future objective. And we look forward to working with the team, including our good Dr. Terbush, to help plan on staff availability. That's a critical resource.
Yep.
Right now, again, I just want to mention our focus is on power and water, just so we can see whether we can solve that problem. And if we cannot solve that problem, then that calls for another Manhattan style initiative. But
Yeah.
okay,
There's another really good question here too by Joseph Robel, and it says new patient hospital arrivals visitors might be a whole sidebar concern slash
yes,
project. If GPS
yes,
goes out, best route to hospital might be a concern. Electronic maps affected. I was discussing that with someone because
yeah.
they people now rely so much on GPS they don't know how to read maps. And
Not yeah, exactly, exactly. You know,
yeah,
I'm glad that question came up
yeah,
because that's
it's a great
another
one.
thing that it's beginning to haunt all of us. And we probably are seeing some of this phenomenon with kids in high school or grade school even. Everybody's so committed and so connected or dependent on their calculators
Hmm.
that in order to do fairly simple multiplication or division, it's very hard to get people to do that
Yeah,
by mental gymnastics. They just rely on, going for that telephone. The same thing, and it's happened to me, probably everyone. We're so dependent on our nav systems in the car that if that nav system isn't available, if you're driving a car that doesn't have one, all of a sudden you got to start reading road signs and you got to start thinking about how do I get from A to B in the
right,
map and so on.
right.
And that,
It's not even the current generation. I don't want to throw them under the bus. My sister's a year younger than I am, and we were in Germany, and our GPS stopped working. And so I handed her a map, because I was driving. And
yeah,
so I asked her to read it, and she couldn't do it. And
yeah.
she's
Well,
extremely bright, and I
yes,
just had to pull over and look at the map myself because she just couldn't do it. So it's something that it's not taught anymore. Even when I was
of
in school,
course.
it really wasn't. No,
Of
so
course, and of course, Maria, I'm not going to speculate on your age, but I can tell you I'm old enough to remember, driving with the left hand and holding a map out with the right hand, trying
and
to figure out, navigating through Europe, for example. My
right,
God,
right, right,
but
right,
somehow we always made it. We got from point A to B and
exactly.
using our native intelligence.
Yeah.
Now, if you depend on the one thing that you have to have, to navigate, and you lose it, that
Mhm.
is a problem. And that's exactly the kind of situation we're going to be facing under black sky conditions. So it's a good question.
Yeah, yeah, and like I said, I mean, we have a collaborative effort already happening between you and what David Moran is up to. So he's going to be
Hmm.
sending you. He actually sent it to me. I'll forward you some of the
Yeah.
projects he's working on. So this is really good. I know you were worried about. Well, are we going to fill in a whole hour? And we're already at minute 48. There's still some time left. So with that, let's we can. You mentioned energy and the advent of data centers requiring massive
Right.
amounts of energy and water. People don't realize how
Right.
much water. Oh, someone told me the other day, and I was just astounded. It's massive gallons of water at each data center will need, and there's going to be this, obviously a competition for resources here, not just with healthcare facilities, but with everything else. Food production needs water. Food
Right.
production needs energy, right? The transportation industry, and what I mean, like cars, manufacturing cars, all this is going to compete with the data centers. Can you talk a little bit more about this? Because this is where I see the big, um, uh, not only a deficiency and challenge, but the competitive nature of data centers just robbing from Peter to pay Paul, right? Kind of
Right.
scenario.
Yeah, I know. That's I worry about that too. In fact, I'm every day now we see the integration of AI into everything we do. Every web browser now has it built in, and you're going to have it built into your spreadsheets and Word and all that. And that's okay. That's a wonderful thing to have that capability. I do wonder at times how many times is AI being used in a non-productive, maybe even a frivolous manner that still costs a lot of energy, right? It
Right.
costs us energy whether your kid wants to play all kind of silly mind games with AI. It I've seen a number that says if you do a simple Google search, it costs X amount of kilowatt hours or watt hours. It takes 10 times the amount of energy to run that to an AI with a more comprehensive answer, which is a wonderful
Yeah.
tool to have. But I wonder if there's going to have to be a way of restricting access in some ways so that it's not misused in a frivolous way. So AI is going to dominate almost every facet of our culture, our life, and so on. And of course, the projections about the 1x, 2x capacity, 200% of additional electricity is what we're talking about.
Right.
That's that's what's going to be needed to keep it alive. But even as we continue to build the electrical capacity, I wonder how much more can we grow this AI because it's going to invade everything we do. It's so much. It's very nice to have. Provides instantaneous answers to a lot of questions, but it's a tremendously expensive proposition in the long run. So I don't know if I
Yeah.
answering that question or not.
Yeah. No, it's good. I mean, I think this black sky power consumption chart really kind of speaks to it.
Well, I wanted to bring that up just to let you know that this is one example of the kind of decision making that a hospital will confront when it goes from blue sky, and then you saw the blue sky picture. All of a sudden, when you enter into the black sky phase, this would be the x-axis is the number of days that you're out of power, right? So if the hospital does nothing and says, let's just keep operating and hope the power comes back in less than 4 days, that's our 96-hour requirement.
Mhm.
So you can run at full scale for a full 4 days. At that point, you're going into shutdown because you totally run out of fuel. What happens? What's the consequence? This little dashed line here is a projection of likely casualties. Now, this are hypothetical. These are not actually, but they are based on some observations, like the Katrina example and others. At some point, if you shut down a hospital, those patients that you have internal and unable to get access, they're going to pass away. So
Yeah.
that likely will, increase as the number of days goes by, right? The options then that would be potentially in consideration is, well, instead of running at full power, let's go down to the blue line and operate at 50%. If I only operate with 50% of the load, in theory, I can run twice as long at that power level, and then I'm going to be shutting down. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is you are at least maybe going to lose less patients on that particular day. Maybe only half as many patients are
Mhm.
lost, and eventually you'll still follow that same path. The same thing would if you go all the way down to 20%. These are hypothetical again. Let's say if we could operate the hospital at 20% power, well, in theory, we could run all the way out to 18, 19 days on that power level, but we will start to lose patients, keep them alive as long as possible, and then we'll start, going up some level. That's a theoretical framework for presenting how the options can be considered for managing power. The same curve applies to water. We have
Yeah.
another set of calculations for how do you allocate the water usage when you're in the black sky. If you got stored capability of several thousand gallons, by the way, hospitals use an immense amount of water, as you
Yep,
mentioned
they do.
earlier.
Yeah.
Numbers like 2 to 300 gallons per patient per day.
Mm-hmm.
That's a phenomenal amount of water. There's no way we can supplement or supply all that water. So our current focus is on what is the most critical use of water that applies to treatments and maintaining patients and so on, and drinking, cooking. If you're going to continue to
Yeah.
cook in the cafeteria, you got to have clean water. So those are the kind of categories. But that's just a representation of the kind of decision options that would be facing the hospital in black sky. Okay, I wanted to get that point across. Does that
Yeah.
make sense to you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And one thing that
Okay.
isn't meant we didn't mention, but is kind of, and this goes in managing the hospital, managing its resources. Refrigeration is huge and a huge
Yes,
consumer of
yes,
energy,
yes.
and and a lot of people don't realize how much medication needs to be refrigerated.
Right, right.
As well as I ran into this during COVID in New York City, but because we the city got containers for the bodies that
Hmm.
and so if the coroner loses their refrigeration
Right.
capabilities, that's a
Yeah,
whole nother
yeah.
scenario. So
I'm glad you brought that up. I just wanted to, I jumped ahead to this one chart, just as an example of the kind of studies that we're undertaking. This is a chart that I remember I mentioned when you're going in the black sky, you have to figure out what are the most essential capabilities that
right.
I have. I have to maintain XYZ functions. And so we're trying to get a list of those together and put them into a table that will allow us to predict the load in kilowatts and also the energy in kilowatt hours that that day of activity consumes. So you mentioned refrigeration. These numbers are hypothetical. This is the number of hours I would have to operate, and that is the approximate load of that function. They're not validated; they're just estimates. But so before the audience starts to, to take me to task about, wait, where'd you get this
Yeah.
number? That's not right. Okay, this is one typical hospital environment, and you can challenge any of those because we're trying to validate these numbers. For example, like food processing, that's a huge cafeteria. There's a huge load, right?
Right.
We're estimating it's 200 kilowatts, et cetera. It could be a lot less, but so we're trying to get this data collected so that we can do an analysis day by day. What happens as on day one of the black skies, day two, day six, day 10. Now we're beyond the ability of the backup generator. We're trying to figure out how much resist a supplementary power we have to provide to keep the hospital alive. So these are the numbers that we've come up with. You mentioned one, refrigeration.
Yeah.
These are all the others. Okay,
Yeah.
so just as an example. Okay,
You might in refrigeration you have food slash med slash corner.
corner.
The
Oh,
corner, the corners, the storage of deceased.
yes, I understand.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah. Because i- if you've ever been in a facility like that, it's cold. It uses a lot of energy, and almost all hospitals have them. They're usually down in the basement.
we
But
have not yet confronted that question
yeah, yeah,
about how to handle
it's
it. Okay,
yeah, yeah.
but it's a very grim reality. You're right,
It
and
is.
it's
It is. It's anyway. Um, and you're wondering, how do I know so much about hospitals?
yeah.
My
How do you know? We have to get you on our team,
was
Maria.
he was chief of surgery at several
Okay,
major hospitals in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he was the head of
okay,
the Santa Clara County Surgical Society for like over 25 years, I believe.
right.
Yeah, so he of course wanted all of us to be doctors and would drag us
Of course.
to his surgeries, things like that, his office, and the more we saw uh, blood and gore, the more I said, I'm not, this is not for me. So, but I was exposed to it very young. So um,
Right.
I'm familiar from it in a familiar sense. In other words, family members.
I understand.
Yeah.
I understand. So
Oh,
that's the story of the hospital, Maria. We're right now in the middle of the process of conducting these. What's the right word? They're not tabletop exercises, but they're brainstorming,
mhm.
attempting to get the administration to figure out how it's going to solve, each problem that arises. For example, each of these areas is a critical need. How do you reduce the load? How do you reduce the electrical load and the water load that
Right.
would be emerging? So these are the things we're looking at.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of food here for thought, and a lot of, like you mentioned, the more, et cetera. Yes, those are very, very difficult, challenging times, decisions.
Yeah, well, thank you. This has been just an absolute learning experience for me, and you're doing some excellent work. And I know we have people in the chat, I think, that would love to collaborate
We'd
with you.
love to have some questions, more questions.
Yeah, yeah. Does anyone have any questions in the chat? I think I put your contact info in the chat,
Okay,
and so people can reach out to you. And a lot of people know how to reach me, and I can forward them your
okay.
information. So, but this has been a pleasure, and I hope to have you again as you continue in your studies and what you're doing, especially once your your
Yeah,
pilot hospital study comes out. It might really be very educational for larger facilities to know what came out
sure.
of it, right? So,
Maria, could I make one more observation
yes, sir.
uh, about this? And I think you asked this before. How do we address this thing at multiple layers of our society? And I'd like to just pose this challenge. I think this is what we're confronting. But by the way, the word sustainable, which has been massively overused in many areas, everybody wanted to promote this sustainable solution or that one and so on. I believe it's legitimate to use it, but only in one context, and that is this. And this is kind of a small area of systems thinking that I'd like to advocate. I think it's legitimate to say we're trying to build something called a sustainable civilization. What does that mean? That means that we want to have the same standards of living, that at least the same, maybe better, to hand off to our kids and grandkids
Mhm.
that we've enjoyed, and not have to suffer through a lot of degradation. So in order to make that happen, this is a kind of a value chain here. The economy has to be robust and strong, and it has to be supported by national and individual infrastructure security. We have to build very robust facilities. All of that, both of those high level categories are in need of resilient infrastructure, improved mobility, and of course, industry. We got to be able to keep making stuff and moving it from here to there and so on. Everything here depends on energy. If
Yep.
we don't solve the energy equation, and that's the big challenge that we have looking ahead, then a lot of this will begin to get very fragile, and we don't think we'll be able to maintain our civilization. So I'd like to put that forward as the major challenge to ponder. Not how do we build a sustainable civilization that lets our kids enjoy the same standards of living and
Yep.
better. And I think that requires national level thinking and priorities, as well as regional and sector, and finally the individual elements of infrastructure, such as a hospital. That's where we are focused right now. But we don't want to lose the focus on the big picture.
Right, right. Now this is excellent. I thank you so much, John, for being on the podcast, and I would love to have you back on again because I think we can dive down deeper in some areas. And
Yeah, we skipped over a lot of stuff, but
yeah,
okay. Well,
yeah, yeah. But this is
I
great.
think
Now, this is like a
maybe we
great
can do
level
it
one.
after we finished our research phase, maybe early
Yes.
quarter next year.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
that would be great. I'd be honored to have you back. And so thank you again. And
thank
for
you.
next, yeah, and for next week we have another great podcast with Mike Sutherland, and he will be discussing municipal critical infrastructure emergency planning, which,
Excellent.
yeah, so we look forward to him and being on the podcast and walking us through his emergency planning. Is he was the emergency planner for Douglas County in Colorado, as well as the town of Parker, Colorado, and and now he does work across the country as a consultant with emergency management and preparedness. So I look forward to that. This podcast is focused on the positive side. You know, I know we've had a lot of someone says, "Oh, it's so gloom and doom," and I no, we want to focus on how citizens can get involved too, right? And especially if you have a engineering background, if you're a scientist, how you can join some of these organizations, these nonprofits like the Foundation for Infrastructure Resiliency or the EMP Task Force on National and Homeland Security. These are organizations that are working with our government to try to address some of these issues that we're bringing up in this podcast. Currently, there is, I mentioned earlier, there's a gap. There's a gap that legislators are not seeing. Really, either well, I can't say they haven't seen because we've actually presented to them, so they know what we need is action and prioritization of this. So, John, do you want to end with any comments? Closing.
Well, I just want to say thank you very much, Maria. I love your podcast. I think you're filling a critical gap that we have in thinking that our society desperately needs. So I really hope that you'll continue to promote these messages to our society. Yes, you're right. It's a lot of doom and gloom right now, but I
Yeah,
do believe that humanity, with a little bit of help from AI, has the capacity to solve the problem. And I'm
yeah.
looking forward to being of some value in helping with that solution process. So thank you very much for your podcast. Thanks again for the
Thank
invitation,
you.
and a shout out to my colleagues on the in the audience. Okay,
Yeah, thank you, Grid Warriors, for joining us. And
Grid
until,
Warriors, Great
yeah,
Warriors.
I call them Grid Warriors. Whether it's water grid, electrical grid, healthcare grid, it's all the same. So thank you. We'll see you next week. Until then, be blessed.
Bye bye.